Okay, a couple minutes passed, so let's go ahead and begin. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the June installment of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation Lecture Series. My name is Whitney Albright. I work in the Science Institute here at the department out of Sacramento and help to organize the lecture series. As usual, I'm going to give just a few quick announcements before we get started, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker and turn it over to him to give the presentation for today. So before we do that, some quick announcements. You have all been muted. You've probably noticed we are muting all the lines just to help preserve the quality of the recording. We are recording the talk today, and the talk will be posted on the Conservation Lecture Series website within the next week or two. We'll get that posted. And as far as a flow for today, I'll introduce our speaker here in just a moment. We'll have a presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the talk. We may also take a question or two during the talk, so please do kind of submit your questions throughout the presentation, and I'll make sure to get those relayed over to our guest speaker. In order to ask a question, please do type any questions that you have into the Q&A box. You'll notice there's both a chat box and a Q&A box icon at your little menu bar there. The chat box is great if you need to or wanting to chat with one another, or if you need to ask us a question, but please do submit any questions for the speaker into the Q&A box. Just a little bit easier for us to keep them organized and keep track of everything there. All right, I think that's all I have by way of announcements. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our guest speaker for today, James Hansen. James is an environmental scientist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. He works out of our Region 3 office, which is the Bay Delta region, and he is part of the Habitat Conservation Planning branch. And before coming to the department, James worked on climate change adaptation, mitigation, research, and policy at national, regional, and international levels. And he also worked on climate change related issues with both public and private sector clients, as well as policymakers and NGOs. And to produce the tool that he'll be discussing during the talk today, James teamed up with EcoAdapt, which is a climate adaptation nonprofit organization, as well as several fish and wildlife departments from Oregon, Washington, and Michigan. And these collaborative efforts have been focused on streamlining the inclusion of climate smart planning into natural resource management decisions. So very excited to hear from James today and all about this cool adaptation tool. So thank you, James, for being here. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Appreciate the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this tool today. I will go ahead and start my presentation, but I just wanted to thank everybody for joining and just showing your interest. You know, this is something that is put a lot of time and energy into it, but it's also a work in progress, and we really would love to get feedback from folks, especially you all. So I'm really happy to see that people are here, interested, and willing to take a little time to discuss the adaptation checklist for climate smart resource management projects. Whitney, can you see everything okay? The slideshow coming up? Fine? Yep,
all good.
Okay, fantastic. So as we call this the adaptation checklist, it is really is supposed to be a useful tool here to help out natural resource managers. So this project was a multi-state approach, as Whitney discussed, teamed up with EcoAdapt. They're a adaptation nonprofit group out of Seattle. Full disclosure, the lead scientist and founder is my sister, Laura Hansen. So that is how we got started working on this together, is that we were sitting around chatting about the need for easier access to data and analysis of climate change projections and how that could be used by natural resource managers. So worked really closely with EcoAdapt, as well as Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank the Science Institute's climate change focus team, the SIFT. So they've been really big help as well. So thank you to all of the folks in the climate change SIFT that donated their time and energy to improving this tool. So before we get too much into the tool and what it is and how it works, I wanted to reassure everybody that this is a helpful resource. This is supposed to be helpful, make your job easier. It is not mandated by the department or the state or anybody. It's not extra work. It's not something you have to do. It's not something to be afraid of. It's just a helpful resource, a tool there to make your job easier. And it's designed to be easy and efficient to use. So that's the goal. And as you listen to this presentation, and as we get into questions, would totally welcome feedback, thoughts, concerns, questions about this tool, and any ideas to make it better. Because the idea is it is supposed to be a helpful resource for you all. It's not supposed to be a burden, and it's definitely not supposed to be sort of additional work on top of what I know is everybody's already very full and busy work schedule. So just a disclaimer up front. And now that we're all excited and not worried about extra work, and we say, hey, look, this is really going to be useful. Now we can jump in and get excited about what this tool can do for you all. So you'll see here the different versions of the tool. Currently, there are 4, and their current form is a fillable and printable PDF. So this is sort of the covers of what they look like. We've got a national version specifically for Michigan, one for Washington, and one for California. Ideally, down the road, if we can get the funding, this tool would become sort of an interactive online tool as opposed to a fillable PDF, something that's just a little bit more accessible, a little bit more easy to use. But as you could imagine, it takes some extra funding to turn that into a really cool and slick online tool. So we've got these 4 versions. This is what the tool looks like on the cover. And the goals of this checklist are to explicitly and really purposefully evaluate the implications of climate change, of future conditions, of our changing climate on projects, function, longevity, and even impact. So not only is this checklist designed to evaluate how you can improve a project to function properly for longer, but also maybe how to reduce the climate change impacts of a project to actually mitigate any sort of greenhouse gas emissions or impacts on function of natural systems. So in order to build these climate considerations directly into the work that you do, we need to consider the implications of future climate conditions. So first step is evaluating these conditions and how they might impact a project. And the second step is considering these implications and building that into the way that you approach your projects, whether you're working in a regulatory branch and you're permitting or you're reviewing design plans, or maybe you're part of a grants program or something like that that's providing funding and wants to identify maybe the best projects that are already designed or identify ways to improve projects that have been proposed that are maybe a good candidate, but could be improved in the face of future projected climate conditions. And of course, this can go into larger scale planning, either policy or maybe on the ground planning for preserve management, wildlands management, management of stock resources. All of these things can be affected by our changing climate, and the way that we approach them now may be improved by some tweaking. And so the idea here is to provide an easy and straightforward, hopefully that's the goal, easy and straightforward way to reduce liabilities, to improve a project overall, and avoid actions that may just be less effective in future conditions. And we see that all the time in the work that we do, and it may be something that's sort of on the back of our minds, but the idea here is to bring this really to the forefront of our thought process in order to improve the work that we do all across natural resource management branches and activities. So this checklist originated as a partnership with a local municipality and EcoAdapt. And it was really a way for this municipality to take their climate action plan that they had developed, and put it into practice, to operationalize the adaptation portions of the climate action plan. Right, this climate action plan included other things as well as mitigation and other things that were not related to adaptation. But the idea here was, let's make something that people can sit down and use and be able to take some of these maybe broader goals in terms of adaptation and really put them into practice. And so the idea really was to assess both, capital expenditure on municipal infrastructure projects, as well as how they performed permitting functions and sort of what they were going to allow moving forward. So that was how this tool was originally designed. And we've sort of reworked it to be less for sort of city managers and to be more designed for natural resource managers and practitioners, essentially state agency workers that work on natural resource issues, to try to facilitate, an easy and efficient inclusion of climate change considerations into our projects. So the process of creating the checklist started with a working group from several different state agencies. We had folks from the state of Washington. This was Chris Hoving. State of Oregon, we had representatives, folks from Idaho, and Michigan. And we had folks that were all natural resource managers, did different aspects of the job, but we're all really interested in this idea of getting something that was tangible, that you could really sink your teeth into and be able to use to improve these projects. So we started out with this working group of several states. You notice they're mostly Western states except for Michigan. And we started beta testing by, we started building out this resource and then trying to use it on example projects, see how it worked, see where it didn't work. There was plenty of places where it didn't work and we had to sort of rework it. And then we started moving into these custom checklists that were designed, geographically. And the reason we did this is because one of the key aspects of this tool, of this checklist, is to provide the best available data for to be used in terms of looking at the implications of future conditions. And as you can imagine, climate change projections are different regionally. And so although, Washington and Oregon and California, we're all on the West Coast, there are definitely regional differences. There is a lot of differences in the data available as well. And so creating these custom checklists for different regional areas allowed us to really tailor the data sources and the other resources to make it really as specific to the location as possible, just to make it more useful. So we also created a national version, which just sort of has the broadest data sources. And, it's not as refined, but it's a really good starting point if they're, you or, someone else that's working in an area that doesn't have one of these custom versions. The national version is a great place to start. Excuse me. So, that was the impetus for customizing these checklists, was to really get some site specific, regional specific data. An example is there's a lot of sea level rise data that we put in for California, Oregon, Washington. But as you can imagine, that wouldn't be applicable to, say, Michigan. So, for the Michigan checklist, we included things that were more related to lakes, lake temperature changes, lake water level changes, dissolved oxygen changes, things like that were a little different from, say, sea level rise, ocean acidification data, things like that were more relevant at a coastal location. So All that to say, we've got both the national version as well as some custom versions for California, Washington, and Michigan regions. So now that you've got kind of a background on how we got here and the process of creating this, I want to walk you all through the tool itself, give you an idea of how it works and what it can do for you, and hopefully get you excited about trying it out and implementing it on one of the next projects you're working on, and seeing if it's useful for you and providing feedback to us so that we can continue to improve it and hopefully continue to provide you with a way to investigate the impacts of climate change on your projects. So it's a 3-step process. Again, try to just really make it straightforward, easy, efficient. 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. First step is what we call the climate quick check. Basically, you're looking at the type of project you have and you're identifying which aspects of a changing climate will be impactful, be relevant, will make an important difference in project design and function over its lifetime. And you're doing this by considering different indicators. And you'll see what I mean as soon as we get into breakdown of each of these steps. But essentially, these are changes to climate that could include changes in precipitation regime, temperature regimes, as well as wildfire prevalence and intensity, maybe geologic instability from erosion, all sorts of different indicators of climate change that can be seen on the ground. Step 2 is evaluating the climate impact on the project. So now that you've identified which climate change indicators could be impactful to your project, step 2 is to explore how those relevant aspects of climate change are going to affect the project by really just going through and answering some simple, specific questions that are going to require you to look at some data. And the nice thing is that we provide really easy links to the best available data for these considerations. And step 3 is a synopsis and then development of options in order to improve that project, to adapt it to a changing climate. So for each of these identified vulnerabilities from step 2, you would then develop adaptation options to either improve the project by minimizing or mitigating future negative impacts and maybe avoiding those altogether, while still being able to deliver the intended benefits of the project. This is not designed to sort of steer people away from doing a project necessarily. The idea here is to be able to improve any project and maybe make it into a good project that could really function properly throughout its lifetime. The idea is to use these supportive resources that are already available from practitioners that have been implementing them, and sort of look through your different options that are available and try to build those into your project. So let's jump into the steps and do a little detailed dive into them, and then we'll go over some examples as well. So this is step 1, the climate quick check, and we're identifying the aspects of the of climate change that's going to be relevant to our project. So first of all, you would choose the type of project that you're working on here. So maybe you're building infrastructure at one of the state-owned lands, putting in a new boat launch, or you're reviewing the permits for maybe a development along the shoreline. Any of these types of projects, or others yet to be determined, that this could be applied to. So the idea is it's not supposed to be exclusive to only a few things. It's really, hey, whatever your project is, let's see how we can improve it and make it function how we intend it to function throughout its lifetime. It's great if you put in a boat launch and it works perfectly over the next 5 years, but if in 15 years it's now above the water level and you've got a big drop off the end, it's not functioning how we want it to, and we shouldn't be expending resources on projects that aren't gonna function throughout their intended lifetime. So all that to say, lots of options here. try to use this tool for really any project that you're working on if it feels like it's relevant and helpful. So once you've clicked your type of project, the next step is looking at and here. So just wanted to show that I don't know if it's going to get cut off on the next slide, but you can see it up here. So we start off by determining sort of where your project is in space in relation to these different impacts that climate change might present. So if your project is near a shoreline, again, let's take that boat dock example, you might be affected in the future by these conditions, sea level rise, flooding, erosion or slope stability. These are all things that we're anticipating could change with a changing climate and will definitely impact your project if it's near a shoreline. And so we've got some of these questions are the same for these different regions, and some of them are different. So, if you're working on a marine project, you may be dealing with some of the same questions as a terrestrial aquatic project, but then also some of them will be different. So if maybe your project hits a couple of these different things, maybe it's an infrastructure project in a marine or estuarine environment, you're going to want to look at both of these sections and go through and select either, yes, this could have an effect on my project, maybe you just don't know yet. Maybe there's more digging to do, more analysis to be done, and so maybe it's a maybe. I'm not quite sure, and then it might just be obvious that algal blooms really are not going to affect the project you're working on, and if that's the case, and great, check no. So those are the three options. Again, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And here's the key for moving between step 1 and step 2 is if you click yes on any of these, yes, sea level rise may affect my project now or in the future, then you would move on to step 2 for that sea level rise question. If you checked no, then great, you're done with that portion. And if you clicked you don't know, then let's go ahead and move on to step 2 anyways, and let's see if we can suss out whether that really will be impactful to your project. And as you can see here on this far tab, if you answered yes or you don't know, then we're going to complete step 2. And in step 2, there's a bunch of different labeled evaluations that help you identify whether this factor really will have an impact on the future success of your project. So step 1, just identifying sort of where your project is and what different changing conditions could affect it. Now, step 2, we are looking at evaluation of these factors. So as you saw in this slide, there's evaluation A all the way through E, and they each correspond to a different climate condition that's changing here. So it's just as an example, here they are all laid out. A is evaluate suitability of project site, species, and or infrastructure to future air and water temperature patterns. And you can see, that corresponds to increased water temperature, diminished dissolved oxygen, all of these things in aquatic algal blooms. That all relates to changing precipitation and temperature. So as you can see, these evaluation questions sort of encompass a lot of these changes that climate change can bring into one kind of clear, concise evaluation. So there's different evaluations for future air and water temperature patterns, sea level rise, and then we've got vulnerability to wildfire, vulnerability to changes, precipitation patterns, changes in ecological function, and then F is actually evaluation of the project's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and or sequestration. So trying to tackle a little bit of mitigation as well. But what these evaluation questions lead you to essentially is a bunch of data. And so here's an example of evaluation A, and this is the one about future air and water temperature patterns. And just to point out, you've got the question here. So this is explain your project's suitability to future temperatures, referring to data sources, local knowledge. And when answering, consider how this may interact with other aspects of climate change you're evaluating. So we provide a list of questions here to just start to get your mind going, get the juices flowing about how the project could be impacted. Does future temperature look different than present? That's an important question to ask, even if it seems simple. It may not be something that we're taking into account. And I think, that sometimes starting with the most simple questions can be the most useful. So we've got a list of questions here. Will the amount of change projected affect your project site, species, or infrastructure? How may water quality be affected? Will temperature change affect crucial functions? So again, these are similar questions, but they're all asking it a little bit of a different way to try to see if this will sort of jog your understanding of the project and sort of push you to think a little bit harder about how it will function in the future. And then really, one of the most useful parts of this whole tool are these data sources for each section. It looks like this one is probably cut from the California tool. You can see, here we've got CalAdapt, local climate change snapshots, CalAdapt maps of projected change. We've got NOAA Climate Explorer. We've got a tool from Pacific Northwest and Great Basin tribes on future climate projections, ENSO status and prediction. So all of these are really great resources that have a ton of data available and can be pretty regionally specific. And all of these data sources are different for the different evaluation questions. Some of them overlap, but there's a ton of data here, and the idea is you don't need to go searching through every single website to find the best projection for you. We've already gone through. We've compiled a lot of good sources that we think provide the best and most up-to-date data. So in my mind, those data resources are really helpful. Even if you didn't want to work through the whole checklist, all you want to do is open it up and find some data sources. Great. I'm glad that was helpful. I'm glad that we could provide those data sources for you. And maybe this tool, all it does is just get you thinking a little bit more about climate change adaptation, and maybe it just provides you with data you need to, for a different project, but that's fine. That's, it's here to be a useful resource. So here's another example of an evaluation question. I won't go through all of these. I think it's not an efficient use of our time, but as you can see, this one's slightly different when we're talking about sea level rise projections. But it's asking a lot of the same questions. I mean, does the future look different than the present? Will the amount of change affect your project? Will this affect other aspects of project design and function? So sometimes we'll actually also provide a little bit of direction, and we'll say to answer these questions, use regional sea level projections for 2100, or if you've got maybe a longer length project, or maybe shorter even, you could change that, and then local knowledge related to coastal flooding. So and then we've provided some suggestions on what level of emissions scenarios to choose in order to get sort of what we think is the best available data. So some of them will be a little bit more prescriptive, will provide a little bit more guidance. Some of them are a little bit more straightforward. And then again, here's more data sources, different data sources for specific to sea level rise, and each custom checklist has data that's specific to a specific region. So I assume we'll all be interested in the California one, but if folks in Washington or in Michigan or anywhere in the country that are interested, please feel free to forward them this. So all of this evaluation of the data, analysis of the data, synthesis of that to try to determine, will the sizing of this culvert continue to function in the future? Will the elevation of this boat dock, continue to be correct? All that evaluation leads us to the question of then, okay, if not, what do we do about it? And I think, steps 1 and 2 maybe things people are doing conceptually already. And maybe they're getting to this point where they're saying, okay, well, we're not entirely sure that this is going to function how we intend it to in the future, but now what? And I think that that can be a huge roadblock for people. So, this step 3 is really the meat of now what? What do we do when we have identified or at least think there may be a threat to the function of our project or policy, our management style? What do we do next? So for each of these identified vulnerabilities in step 2, we're going to develop adaptation options to avoid, minimize, and mitigate future negative impacts. And again, the goal here is still to make it so the project functions how we've designed it. It's not to sabotage the project, it's in fact to make it function better. So still want to deliver those intended benefits, and we're going to use adaptation support resources to find out possible options. So we're trying to, really identify ways to reduce these vulnerabilities that we've already discussed previously. So here's a zoom in on what step 3 might look like. And it's, essentially a workbook to get your thoughts out here. So if, temperature, that evaluation A, is something that you identified, from looking at that data to be affecting your project, you would then write out implications of the issue for the project being assessed. So, if again, if you've got this boat dock and it looks like a sea level rise occurs, your boat dock's going to be constantly, underwater, and maybe so much so that you can't even see it when you're backing down and people are driving off the side of the levee or something. That can be an implication of sea level rise on your project design, and you may want to extend that ramp a little farther uphill or something to that effect. So this is where you're going to write down implications of the project being assessed. And maybe it's, management of a fishery stock, and the implication is that as temperature changes, rearing is no longer going to occur in the same location, and you may want to change where you're going to do your hatchery releases based on that. So the implication could, can be varied, can be totally different across the board. The idea is for you to just sort of get down on paper. Here's really is the biggest issue that we see from these indicators. So you may be working on a bunch of these at once. It may just be one. But then this next step is, once we've identified the issue, how it's going to affect the project, then here's where we start working on adaptation actions to increase suitability for future conditions. And you may be saying, well, great, but I still don't know what to do. I don't have good examples to work off of. I've, never had to build this into a project before. That's great. We've got all this good data to tell us it's a problem, but now what do we do? As we'll get to on the last page of the checklist, there is, and I don't know if I have a good slide of this, but if not, I can pull it up after. There is a whole page of additional resources, but there's also a link to CAKE, which is the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. I believe the website is cakex.org. And that website has case studies, it's got research, it's got gray papers, it's got all sorts of examples of people and managers just like us that have had these same problems and that are coming up with solutions and maybe trying things that didn't work. But all these resources are available, and it says if needed, use resources for identifying adaptation options on the next page. So there's a whole bunch of adaptation options that are provided through links to mostly to this Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, but other resources as well. And the idea is that, if we could get the funding to turn this into sort of a digital resource, that it wouldn't just be, okay, turn to the next page and then follow some of these links. It would auto-populate all of the case studies and research examples that would be relevant to the indicators that you've identified as being a potential issue. So that's the idea. It would be really great to get this into a digital version We'd need some more funding to make it happen. None of us are web developers, so we'd have to be able to pay someone to develop a website to make this really streamlined. But as of now, essentially, you identify these issues and implications, and then we provide just a list of resources similar to those data resources for how you actually tackle this. So I'll talk a little bit more about those resources at the end, but I just wanted to go through a few quick examples of, sort of why this checklist can be useful, and examples of, when it hasn't been used in the past, sort of what the implications can be, and sort of the need for these checklists. So this tool and this presentation, we've given this at several conferences and working groups. And so some of the examples are from some of the partners from different state agencies. So let's jump into these, and then we'll do questions at the end. So this one, this is Chris from Michigan DNR. He's out looking at a weir controlling the outflow from a lake to a river system in the Michigan area. And this is something that the Department of Natural Resources put in themselves. As you can see, this is a new project. They just, put in, sort of armored these banks, put in this weir with a notch here. You can see the rest of the outline of sort of where the top of this weir notch is. And obviously this just regulates the flow of how fast this water, leaves the lake. If the lake level drops too much, it'll sort of cut off flow from there. And the idea, so they're managing these lakes as natural resource and habitat for the native species in the area. So Chris is out here investigating the project site, and this was August 13, 2013. And when he went out there, this is a state-owned property. He was asking the folks that manage the property, his colleagues, how they designed it, what they took into consideration when designing this project. And he asked them if they considered, the implications of climate change on the frequency and intensity of storms, and they sort of looked at him like they didn't know what he was talking about and said, we designed this just by, the existing standards. It's good to go. This is what we always do. Don't worry about it. And Chris knows they're all good at their jobs. He said, okay, sounds good. Let's see how it functions. So this was August 13th. And overnight, I think they got a massive storm, and you can see water levels overtopping this. So these are those same sort of weir wings that we saw. This is that low flow notch. It's ripping through here pretty good. You can't even see the riprap anymore. That's getting inundated and already starting to have some erosion. And this was a big storm. I think this was way outside their norm in terms of how much rain and snow they were getting in April. So this is it in August. This is when they put it in the summer. Over the winter, they get one of the really biggest storms they've ever seen. And then this is the next day. So within a day of realizing that this thing was not going to function how they thought it was, the entire section of this levee blew out, and essentially have an ineffective, non-functioning weir, and over time this this entire lake drew down much further than they intended it to, and they lost sort of a whole season of functioning habitat for migratory birds and other wildlife that were using this. So, just as an example that this was, something that was designed to standards. It wasn't done improperly. It wasn't done poorly. But that being said, it didn't take into consideration, a really big storm that was out of the norm for that time of year. So, this is just one example of sort of why it's important to consider changing climate and the implications on a project. So this was an example from Michigan. This morning reading about that big lake that's forming down in the Central Valley after all of these, sort of record snowpack melting and record rains, and made me think, if if that projected change in frequency and intensity of storms had been sort of built into flood management and design in that area, we may be seeing sort of a different impact and effect here. And not saying that the giant lake is bad, but I'm sure all the farmers and homeowners in that area are pretty upset that that their livelihoods are now underwater. So just there's lots of examples that we can think about as our climate changes, of how projects can be improved and design can be improved, management can be improved, and not to say that the way that we're doing it is wrong, or there aren't lessons to be taken from how we've been doing things for decades, but this is a resource designed to just continue to improve on what we're doing and make sure that the projects that we fund and implement and manage continue to work. So potential uses in California, we've talked about a few of these things, but just to give you some examples. Design review and permitting, maybe it's a large infrastructure project that we are permitting, and we want to understand, how, if they've really thought about some of these climate implications on the design of the project, just to make sure it continues to function, make sure that it's not any more impactful to the habitat than the design is currently. So improving, design review and permitting, identifying projects to fund or improving projects that we are already funding, as well as restoration, conservation, and land management, whether it's creating an adaptive management plan and building in adaptation actions into that project and that plan, or maybe it is implementing a restoration project and making sure that it actually turns into the habitat type we want, as opposed to going a different direction because we misunderstood sort of the future temperature or precipitation regime. So these are just a few examples. I think the idea is that anybody can use it, and it's supposed to be just really a helpful resource. Again, this is not mandatory. This is just something that we want to provide as a tool in your tool belt to be able to manage the resources more effectively. So rollout in California is just happened this year. There was a lot of help from the Science Institute. Climate change focus team was really helpful in reviewing this, and Science Institute was nice enough to put it in their climate change newsletter. We've got it hosted on some of our department websites in the Science Institute, and as we roll this out, we really would love people to just take some time, try it out on a project, see if it is helpful, see where it can be improved, and let me know. Give me feedback. Let me know if you want to chat about it. Let me know if you have ideas. And so yeah, so as the Science Institute's just sort of rolling this out, helping us get the word out a bit, hoping people will go check it out and utilize it. So it can be found on the EcoAdapt website. It can be found on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website, through state agencies, and then we've also got, this is sort of the current site where it's housed for just anybody that wants to download these resources. But you can also email me. I'll be happy to forward it to you, and we can send out a link as well. So please, use the tool yourself. If there's since we've got a California version, I suggest using that. If you're working on a California project, there's a national version for folks that are outside of some of these specialized areas. If folks are interested, I know EcoAdapt is willing to work with groups to create kind of customized versions that may be more specific to exactly what you do or your region or area. You can feel free to contact myself. You can contact Laura Hansen at EcoAdapt. And I should mention that Christopher Hoving was the representative from Michigan DNR, and Lynn Helbrecht, who is formerly with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. They were, really, really big teammates, and they provided a ton of help on this project. So big thank you to them. Big thank you to Laura at EcoAdapt, and also a big thank you to Northwest and the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Centers and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that's where we got the funding. Most of us just volunteered our time, but there was some need to get some design stuff done and things like that. So that funding came from these organizations, and we really couldn't have done it without them. So big thanks to all those people that contributed, and maybe a thank you in advance to anybody in the department or folks that you all know and work with that are willing to take this out for a spin, take it for a test drive, see if it's helpful, and provide feedback. We want to continue to improve this. Like I said, it would be really great if we could get some additional funding to turn this into a online interactive tool. I think that would really streamline things, but right now it's in this fillable PDF version. And if anybody wants a copy, they can find it online. They can also email me or reach out to me. So yeah, big plug for anybody that's interested that wants to take a stab at this. Please do, and please provide feedback so we continue to improve this. And thank you all for your time. Thank you for being here, and I hope we've got some questions. I'm here to answer any questions that you all have.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Yeah, man, climate change can definitely be a very daunting topic, and it's sometimes hard to know where to start when addressing it in a project. So I really appreciate how this tool does such a good job of kind of distilling that complicated topic down into some tangible steps and kind of really walking people through the process in a way that's organized. I kind of love that about it.
That's the goal. That's the goal.
Yeah. We do have some questions here. And before I get into those, I want to say I did copy down this link here is the best link, right? The one that's on the screen. I'm going to plop that into the chat so that people can grab it that way. One question that came up that's something that you were just touching on, so I wanted to ask you this one first, is someone had asked if there's a way to view the other agencies' checklists as a template for others moving forward. So I know you had offered that to reach out to EcoAdapt about potentially customizing or developing other templates, but are some of the other states, I think, checklists available too?
Yeah, totally. So all four of these, the national, Michigan, Washington, California, this is what we have so far, are these four. Any four of these, all available. It's not like you have to work in Washington for the Washington one to be available. You can download any and all of these, all available at the same place. So yes, you can totally download them. I think the version that you'll get from the download is probably a fillable PDF. I'm not sure if folks are looking for some sort of Word version or something in order to manipulate it themselves. I don't know if that's possible at this moment, but they could definitely use one of these as a template. And yeah, if there was a desire and a minimal amount of funding available to create a specialized, customized version, totally open to doing that. And I know I'd be happy to work with EcoAdapt and you all to at least discuss that and sort of what it would take to get something like that done.
This is a comment, but I wanted to share it with you and the audience. We have someone who said, thank you, James. The tool could also be used for filling out a CEQA checklist and or developing an EIR or an EIS. So just some other potential applications.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. So yeah, totally.
All right, I have another question here. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for James, please do type those into the Q&A box instead of the chat box, and I'll make sure to capture all of them. Next question we have is, what is the time horizon that's used for future conditions? And I guess, is that something that's prescribed or that you have flexibility, or kind of do you have a recommendation on time horizons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is it depends. A lot of the data sets have different time horizons, to be honest, and you may have to extrapolate, the one that's best for your situation. One project may only have a lifespan of 5 years, and you would really want to dive into shorter range data. But if your project's, has a 100-year lifespan, you'd want to be sort of looking at a different end of the spectrum on that data. So I think it depends. I think some of the more complicated climate factors, we try to provide a little feedback in the tool itself, like that example I showed for sea level rise. We tried to say, okay, use projection out to 2100, use the emissions scenario that we suggest, just to provide a little consistency. And we think that that's sort of the most realistic suggestion. So for some, there's some explicit directions and advice. For some, it's just sort of going to be dependent on your project. And so the idea is not to say, oh, you have to analyze this out to X number of years. It's really just tailor it to your project and the lifespan that you desire out of your project. So that's the best answer.
Yeah, definitely seemed like it would be project dependent. And I just to add to that, California has, at least if you're working in the marine environment or the kind of coastal environment, we have a sea level rise guidance document for the state, which may or may not be linked in here, I can't remember. And they actually have some guidance for folks who are developing projects on how to select an appropriate climate change scenario or sea level rise scenario, depending on what your project is. So that's kind of specific to a certain geographic region, but that can be something that helps you figure out what time horizon and what projections are most appropriate. So I think there may be some other tools like that out there too, but that can kind of help you to make that decision. All right, thanks for that. I had a couple more questions here. Kind of about the checklist itself and some about the plans for it. But so you mentioned some great tangible examples during the presentation. Has there been, and maybe this is too early to answer this question, but has there been any attempt to collect some examples of others that have used the checklist successfully? If they are in fact documenting, I guess, their process in some way, have you been able to collect any examples, or is there a plan to do that, to share examples with others, people that are thinking about using the tool?
Yeah, I'll answer that in reverse order. Yes, there absolutely is a plan to do that, but we just haven't had the time yet to have a lot of people use it. And honestly, that's one of the reasons that I jumped at the opportunity here to give this presentation, just to get more people using it. I mean, we just rolled this out in March, so it's only been a couple months here, and we've presented this at the climate, the National Adaptation Forum back in the winter in Baltimore. But it's that at that point it was a beta program. We have a beta version. We didn't really have a finalized version. So short answer is no, we don't have a great collection of examples yet. But the hope is that, so as you saw, some of our examples are why we need it. And that was to sort of generate interest and get people using it. So no, don't have a collection yet of examples. Absolutely plan to do that, would love to do that, and sort of need your help. So bit of a call for help here to get some feedback and some examples of using this. So yeah, other than sort of personal use, we don't have a great collection yet of examples.
That actually feeds into the next question I had is, since you're kind of seeking some feedback on using the tool, is there, there's obviously plans to kind of update the checklist. Will that be kind of an iterative process where kind of new versions may be released over time, or is it a pretty set, like, okay, this is going to be updated every 5 years, or is it just like kind of as you get new information in, this will be modified over time?
Yeah, I think it's, as we get new information in, it'll be modified. I think in terms of giving feedback, if anybody does want to use it and give feedback, just talk to me directly, send me an email, and you can give me feedback that way. In terms of updating the tool, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for creating new versions. So versions for, different regions. but yeah, I mean, as the data changes, we'll want to update these things. And so it's intended to be a living document. It's intended to be a constantly improving tool. And if we can get it to, to the point where it's an interactive online thing, that'll be a lot easier to do that. We wouldn't have to like push out updates and send notifications that, hey, we've updated it, the data sources or updated X, Y, and Z. So that would be great. So yeah, the idea is that this is sort of the first step towards creating a much more interactive tool that would be easier to constantly sort of update and improve.
Yeah, I can see where having a digital version would be really nice for creating longer lists of data sources, because right now you're kind of constrained by the physical document, but I'm sure there's lots of data sources that will be developed or that folks on the line probably already know of and could contribute to a longer list. So it would be great. It'll be great to work towards that.
Yeah.
Let's see, I think we've grabbed all of the questions in the Q&A box. So if you do have any last lingering questions, please go ahead and type those in now. And then we'll close out here in just a moment. But I did want to say too, I just really would encourage folks to try it out, use it for your own project application. I dropped the link to the checklist in the chat box, so please go ahead and give it a spin. Let James and his team know what you think. And I really appreciate something that you said earlier, James, too, about how it can really be used in different ways. So maybe it's not sitting down and going through the entire checklist, but you could still benefit from even step one and kind of walking through that piece. So however it potentially helps you to answer questions, I think is fantastic. And being able to provide that feedback to James and the development team, I'm sure would be appreciated.
Absolutely. Yeah, I second that. And yeah, if you want to skip any part, or all of it and just take, take a data source out of there, whatever it is, that's great. It's supposed to be a resource. So yeah, absolutely. Don't feel like you have to sit down and do the entire thing, although we think that would be beneficial for you and we think it would be helpful and we would love feedback, but it's also here just as a resource. And I just wanted to, they didn't have a good slide of this. This is after step 3 here that we discussed. And there's this, I mentioned resources for identifying adaptation options. So this is what that next page would look like. And it gives you sort of a step-by-step of going to this cakex.org and then tells you how to get to all of the different resource types that you might be looking for, documents and tools. And then there's also general collections here. California's climate change assessment, you've got Safeguarding California, you've got a lot of different resources here of adaptation options, examples, resources, toolkits, all sorts of stuff. So this is what I was talking about in terms of providing the actual resources to answer that question of what do we do next. And right now it's something you got to kind of do yourself. You got to click on the website, you've got to work your way through, So ideally this would be interactive. This would auto-populate. Once you finish step 3, you would just, boom, you get a whole list of things that would be super relevant to you. Right now, you've sort of now got to go through and do it on your own. So that's definitely an area for improvement, but just wanted to show what this resources for adaptation options looks like in the tool. So a lot of options there. And yeah, so that's it. Please do give us feedback. Please do try it out if you're interested. And absolutely feel free to reach out to me with questions or, just to chat about it. We'd be happy to. So thank you all for your time. And Whitney, thank you for the opportunity to share this tool. And yeah, appreciate everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. And I just want to tack on to your plug too. If anyone at the department has a chance to use this, I'd also love to hear how it goes. I don't think I mentioned this at the top of the hour, but for those of you I haven't met, my role at the department is a climate change specialist. So trying to find whatever tools and resources are helpful to staff is something that's important to me. So I'd love to hear what you're using and how, and if it's useful to you. So would definitely be interested in that feedback. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and close it out. James, any final remarks before I wrap us up for the day?
Other than, I would also just say if you use it and you don't like it, please also let me know. Don't be shy. Don't rip the Band-Aid off too hard, but also that's the kind of, we need feedback from all directions. So if it doesn't work for you, let us know why. If it does work, great, we love that feedback too. So don't be shy, reach out if you end up using it. and, give us your honest thoughts on it. That would be really appreciated.
Well, thank you again, James, for making the time to be here and share this with our staff and beyond. Really do appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us today and continuing to join these lecture series talks. It's great to have the support from you all, so appreciate you being here. And just a quick reminder, we did record the talk today, and we'll try to get that posted within the next week or two on the department website. So we have, go to the Conservation Lecture Series page. There's an archive page where all of our recorded talks are posted. And then I just saw one last quick question in the chat. Someone had asked if the links are public, and I believe they are.
Yeah, this is not proprietary, or it's just a tool that we've created in conjunction with, with the department and with EcoAdapt. So yeah, totally available for the public. They're designed for natural resource managers, but they could be useful for the public as well. So yeah, totally.
Great. All right. Thanks so much,
you all.
everyone. Yeah, thanks. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.